I'm doing an addendum to a video I just did because in the process of making the icon for it, I made a kind of a meme for the icon. And basically it says the original reason for a law was as a ban on a loophole in a law that they were trying to pass that they threw out. So the basis for the whole thing is garbage. It never had a reason to be there. It accomplished nothing. And it was done while people yelled, do something. A tragedy's happened. Now, the first thing that someone's going to have come out of their mouth is, oh, you're one of those people who's claiming everything's a reactionary thing and you're against it. No, I'm not. I'm in favor of most of the reactionary laws that get passed. I figure, yeah, do something. If it actually has an effect, great. If after a time it has no useful effect, make sure there's a sunset clause, like the assault weapons ban, as it's commonly called, because maybe it won't do any good. You can argue that I'm wrong or whatever, but if anybody decides to characterize me as taking on a political stance on something as practical as safety or eliminating tragedies, number one, I don't appreciate it. Number two, it doesn't apply to me. So what's the specific meme I made? Well, I'm going to bring up the history, the dawn of time thing. 1800s to 1880s, people in the United States were, in almost every case, not regulated in any way. As far as literally anything. You could buy medications that promised to make you live forever because it contained mercury and lead fulminate. Or some other heinous, stupid thing. Yeah, lead and mercury are bad. They shouldn't be in anything you consume. But people were allowed to get away with that. And even today, if you just call it a food supplement, you're allowed to get away with basically poisoning people almost. And in fact, in some cases, it's actually been poisonings. We are a country that steals ideas from everywhere and doesn't like being regulated. But after any tragedy, whether you think it's right or not, people tell their governors and government and their representatives that rarely represent us, do something or we're going to fire you and put someone in who will. And by the time any election happens and then anybody remembers it, even if the person gets fired, they just elect somebody else. And it doesn't matter because they've all forgotten about what they were freaked out about a year ago. The often listed reason for what I'm talking about is the St. Valentine's Day massacre causing the National Firearms Act. That isn't actually true, but it is kind of. Now, hindsight may be 20/20, especially if you're a jackass like me. But what was the effect of making the legislation we're going to talk about? And I'm going to explain it. Nothing. The original legislation that became the National Firearms Act had a particular set of goals in mind. You can look up the history of it. But I'm only going to touch on a really tiny part of it, so I'm mischaracterizing it entirely here, you might say. Banning handguns. That's literally what this is about. And I'm talking about rules that were put in place presuming to ban handguns. I don't care about the practicality or even the utility of the rules that we're going to be talking about. I'm talking about what is the origin story and the intent for making rules restricting what we in the United States can have. If you argue that the intent to restrict access to, let's say, hydrogen power is the intent is by the oil companies trying to keep you from making your mystery carburetor work or whatever, you're making the intent rather than what is actually overtly said or even how effective it is. You're arguing that the intent, the evildoers, wanted this to happen. And then you can say, moo-ha-ha, they failed, but that was their intent. And therefore that's why I don't like, everybody with red hair or whatever your conspiracy theory is. I'm stating the intent in the National Firearms Act, one of the intents that we're talking about, was to ban handguns. Because unless you're sticking your head up your ass really firmly, it's not AR-15s and AK-47s that are used. in the majority of shooting incidents in the United States and criminal acts. It's handguns. And it was back in the 1930s. Period. Because handguns and ammunition were reliable enough to be dangerous to others and not just almost a toy. Background. Most of the firearms that we have in the United States are derived from or directly related to or are identical to firearms we had in the 1800s. Period. The semi-automatic, auto-loading, 45 ACP, been through 2 wars, 1911, hint, hint, was created in 1911. Other guns that were made earlier have a similar peculiarity of being, like, literally named after the year they came out. They've been around a long motherfucking time. A lot of guns are legal for you to own that you would think would be illegal if you read the laws as they are with the ATF. And the ATF has actually gone out of their way to try to make sure that these loophole guns, you mean guns you're not allowed to regulate and have to shut up about? Yeah, have gone away. They've encouraged them to be destroyed, confiscated, held only in museums, and demilled or deactivated by, making them not fire. And it's almost a intent, moo-ha-ha, we're regulating. This includes a 12-gauge handgun that just happens to use a slightly unusual cartridge. And if you're not aware of it, if you build a reproduction of something that's legal, it inherits that legality. Other countries don't do that. Some cities, counties, and states don't allow you to do it. But the majority of the United States does. I'm allowed to make an imitation version of this break action or whatever 12-gauge handgun. It's not regulated. I haven't talked about it. It's not really a 12-gauge handgun. It's a 10-gauge handgun. And I'm thinking of sending off the ATF letter, since you let me build a 10-gauge, which is bigger than a 12-gauge. For fuck's sake. You allowed this to exist, and it's not regulated. If I make an imitation of it, am I allowed to put a sleeve converter for 12-gauge ammo? By the way, if you're not aware of it, it's antiquated, and the ammo doesn't exist because of the way the ignition works. That's it. It's a Pinfire 10-gauge shotgun pistol. There's also 12-gauge versions. It's not modern cased ammunition. It's antiquated. It's a Pinfire. It's a Pinfire that can take out your car engine and blow your door down by shoving the car into it. It's not really that powerful, but you get the idea. I mean, it's not... The fact that they might regulate the 12-gauge Pinfire more because you could kind of get away with shoving a shotgun shell in it that won't go off. Well, we don't know about that. I mean, they really balked at that. But the 10-gauge, that's okay. It's a fucking hand cannon. Also, they aren't regulating another gun. It's a Howdah. But it's a short barrel. Yeah, but they're not regulating it because it's older than 1880. It was it's even bigger. It's like a 4-gauge. It's a 105 caliber rifle pistol. They made a pistol and rifle pair, and it fires a slug, but you can put shot in it. It's even bigger. They don't regulate it because there was a Pinfire version. And then they had to admit that if you make a Pinfire version of anything, it's not regulatable, which means even if they catch you with it, they can't claim you refused to notify them of it because it's none of their damn business. See? So, no, there's no law against quote-unquote sawed-off shotguns if they start off being some weird format. And yes, there's a couple of instances, it's not 12-gauge, but it's smaller, but it's almost the same thing, of ridiculously overpowered handguns that existed at the time that are over 50 caliber and are not regulated because they're antiquated, but they use centerfire ammunition. It's centerfire using a pin. It's a dry as rifle, and it fired a 78 caliber ball. And it's literally the privateer people keep talking about and invoking when they talk about, we used to have privateers. Well, they're not regulated. Build one. They're not available, but they're also unregulatable because they're too old. any firearm that was commonly available before a certain date that used cased ammunition or not, that doesn't have the ammunition readily available, is not regulated, because you'd have to maintain your own supply of ammunition. That's literally the basis for it. I could literally, legally, open or concealed carry, dead ass, an overpowered fucking handgun, as long as it uses an unconventional firing mechanism that's antiquated and has historical value. It's actually the reasoning for it. So let's talk about the loophole rule. I'm going to repeat again the reasoning at the time, which did make sense for them to outlaw handguns, which is the only reason for really the majority of the stuff we're going to talk about in the NFA, National Firearms Act 1934 or whatever, is because they were trying to outlaw handguns. And then they found out something disturbing. Virtually every one of them talking about it owned a handgun and didn't want to give it up and didn't want to pay $200 for a tax stamp for it, unless they were rich. Second, this made it obviously a law against being poor, which wasn't going to work, and it was going to immediately be thrown out. And they were still trying to get rid of what the criminals were using. Well, the only other thing in the news was a few isolated incidents of criminals using sawed-off shotguns and sawed-off rifles. Now, why do people own those? If you're not aware of it, I'm going to inform you of something very strange. Before they worried about all the handguns, criminals would reliably carry a long gun, specifically 12-gauge shotguns and variations of it, that were long on purpose. They wanted something very visible and not concealable to scare the shit out of people. They wanted to intimidate them while they robbed a bank or whatever. They didn't need a concealed weapon. They didn't want one. Well, that doesn't sound right. That means we'd have to outlaw long guns. Oh, okay. Literally making 100% of gun owners in the United States criminals overnight. That's not going to work. Handguns are a little bit less likely to get a backlash. Nope, they found out that most of them had handguns. Okay, what do the tiniest number of people have so we can at least look like we're doing something? Well, poor people, if the gun blows up on the muzzle because it got dirt in it, cut the barrel down. How about we go after sawed-off weapons? So they put that in there. They put it in originally because it was people converting a long gun into a short-barreled gun, so it's like a handgun. That's where it came from. The SBR, short-barreled rifle or shotgun, or sawed-off shotgun and chopped rifle laws, were originally only as part of a law that never got passed to outlaw handguns, which, by the way, again, would have done something. It would have actually done something, but it would have done it to the people who are making the laws. Laws are not supposed to apply to me. If I'm making them, I won't be subject to my own laws. So they looked for something nobody gave a shit about. Sawed-off shotguns and pistols. And yeah, it fucked over a lot of poor people. And that was literally it. Its basis for existing was legally wrong. But it still got rid of concealed weapons. It initiated people saying, if you have concealed weapons, we should regulate them. So that actually happened. But the rule about me not being able to have an all-metal flare gun that really is just a handgun that fires 12-gauge shells is dumb. Also, I should point out, you can build these short-barreled rifles by just making a rifle chambered handgun. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And, to an extent, shotguns that can be made, yeah, they exist, that are at 26 inches, which is just barely concealable, are legal. And again, I can get away with violating this rule by not violating it by just using a weird cartridge. A Pinfire 12-gauge shell will do the same thing a normal 12-gauge shell will do. There is no actual difference. And the ATF can't regulate them because it's grandfathered enshrined in a law that's precarious if they ever bring it up again. And that's why these laws don't make sense and were never meant to, and they were just meant to make it look like they were doing something. And the other thing is, this is also the reason they should be abolished. Just because I want an all-metal flare gun so that it doesn't break on the first shot doesn't mean I'm going to load a shotgun shell in it. Ever. It's not a good way to do things. Don't do that. It kicks too much. Even a light load. That's why we use long guns. And again, originally the criminals used big guns because they scared people. They only used the short ones because they wanted to do massacres. Give your opinion on this. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.